Hi, everybody. Welcome to the next episode of Psychic Perspectives. Thanks for joining me. My name is Carol Geilers, my lovely co host, Sarah Camp.
Hey.
Before we get started, we just want to say that we're thankful for everyone who's been supporting the channel. And we do ask that you continue to like, subscribe, and share, help us grow, help us expand. And always, if you have comments, we would love to hear from you. So please take a moment and give that a little extra click. We would really appreciate that. So let's get today's episode. What we really wanted to talk about, and again, this was your idea, which I thought was a great one. It's like, how are we going to get people to kind of take a look at whether or not they should be doing investigations at home, right? Did you consider it an investigation? Is that how you would label it? Or just doing random spiritual work at home even, right?
It's more like the random spiritual, I just want to record, paranormal activity at home is right. What we were going to
not really an investigation. So let's just kind of look at that. If you're interested in saying, I want a spiritual connection, or I'm really curious to doing something, and whether you're interested in EVPs. But the other thing too, is sometimes you see that people will pull out spiritual tools, for example, right? Whether that's a pendulum or a dowsing rod or a spirit board, or even perhaps, a deck of intuitive cards. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And that's what we're going to get into with our conversation today, where we're going to talk about, let's look at some concerns and some issues if you're going to do that. Let's talk about ways that you can do it safely. And so that you can kind of protect yourself a little bit if that's something that you feel like you really want to do. So that's where we're going to go today, right?
Yep.
And so what inspired you? I guess you said you had a recent situation that came up. Which was interesting because last week, so did I.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So we've had quite a few cases in the past where, people might actually live in a house that's super active and they want to record the activity that's happening to them, which nothing wrong with that, except for when it becomes sort of an obsession. Or just too much, like all the time trying to get this evidence, and it becomes kind of an addiction, I think.
Very true. Very true. Yeah.
And I really wanted to warn against it for the most part, because it can cause more problems than anything. And unless you have, a solution-oriented intention behind recording this kind of activity, I don't recommend it, period.
No, I agree with you. That's very true. And I think you raise a good point. There's a difference between documentation, right, where we're documenting what's happening in the home, so that we can share those insights or have record of those, versus having this open-ended intention of, I'm just going to encourage the activity to continue so that I can document it. Those two things are very, very different. And it really, my scenario last week, it was not my case. It was actually an investigator from another team, but he had kind of reached out to some of us and said, hey, what are your theories on this? And so on and so forth. So I kind of got to observe from afar and share a little bit of input. But again, some of the things that had ended up happening in the home may have been a result of someone just wanting to have a connection, right? Just wanting to have that. And I think as human beings, we are all curious about life after death and communicating with spirits. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. The question is, how can we do that properly and safely? And that's what we want to talk about today.
Right. Okay, so I was going to ask you, do you remember when we did the ITC experiments at my house?
Of course, absolutely. Yes. Okay. Yes.
So instrumental trans communication, right? Okay. So basically what this does is it takes a recording of a bunch of different voices. That's like the baseline, and it works kind of like a radio suite where it takes all the different voices, and you're supposed to be doing sort of an EVP session with an intended person that you'd like to contact on the other side. And then you ask the questions, you record, and then you listen to the recordings later. This kind of Well, we had some pretty profound results, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, it was interesting. It was tough from the scientific perspective for me to really separate whether or not those things were actually, we disagreed on that, which is why we do the show. But go on with your story. Yeah.
Yeah. So because we did it a few different times. And, this was before I was doing astral or anything like that. So, it was strictly just on the mediumship curiosity level. However, I did notice that there were some things that happened afterwards or in between, meaning it was very slight, but it was still kind of opening this, bridge or creating a portal almost for
And so
things.
did this happen to you personally at a psychic level per se, or was this
Yeah.
something that you meant that you felt happened in your home?
No, like this happened in my home.
Okay. Gotcha. Okay.
So yeah, it was interesting. And it
And
was
they
all
weren't detrimental, but you were
Mhm.
aware of them. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. No, it wasn't negative by any means, but it was noticeable. And so by just doing that, I think is a good example of maybe why we need to be careful, even when we're contacting our loved ones, for example, right? Um,
But on the flip side of that, I mean, as a medium or even you doing your astral work, we do those things from home. We are open up and we are connecting at home. So people will say, well, what's the harm and what's the danger? And again, those are things we're going to talk about today because I sit here in my office and I open up and I connect to spirit, right? For either myself or for other individuals. And so in many ways, I'm inviting a spirit exchange in my home as well. And I think
right.
that's why we want to talk about the fact that, look, yes, can it be done? I think we just need to be aware of the dangers and setting up those parameters so that we're able to do those types of things safely. Is that kind of expressing what you're saying?
Yeah, yeah. Because I mean, we did have really good results. Like I think, I would do it again. But for anyone else that is just, oh, okay, let's do that. It's like I would definitely put precautions in place
Absolutely.
before just opening up that portal,
Right.
because it is kind of like you're opening up a portal. I mean,
And we also, yeah,
way of, you know,
right,
same thing with a spirit board, for example.
right,
Most people know them as Ouija boards, but there's all kinds of different types of spirit boards.
right, right.
And the same thing applies, when you're using one of those, because on one hand, I strictly do not recommend them at all. And then on the other hand, it's like, well, if you know how to keep yourself safe and
Correct.
how to use them properly, then go ahead, but you still run a risk. And so that's why I think this subject of bringing up, investigating in your own home was important, because some people don't understand that. I think recording, and when you start to give the spirits this kind of energy and acknowledgement, and you keep feeding it to them, the activity continues to grow.
Correct.
So that's why I say it's like, if you're going to do it for evidential purposes, that's fine. But at some point, you kind of need to put a cap on it and say, okay, well, now I know what it is. Now, how do I, solve the problem or deal with this in an according way?
Or if you're a budding medium or psychic or and you're having spirit visitations and you want to continue to develop, again, likewise, is like, we don't always need to be fearful of those, but we do need to set up some guidelines. Those things are extremely important, which is why when you're emerging with your psychic and or your mediumship skills, people will say it's important to get some training, to get some education, so that you can learn how to protect yourself, protect your environment, and just set some boundaries up. So let's kind of move into then share some of the potential concerns and issues that surround doing this type of work. Because I think we've given people kind of a good idea of how and when some of these scenarios can come in. And I think the first point that we've both kind of already made is you don't want to have an open invitation to just any old spirit that'll stop by, right? I mean,
Exactly.
because when you're doing this, yeah, when you're connecting with a loved one, there's an intention. But a lot of times when people are doing this, they're not having an intention. They're just like, wow, who's there? right?
Right. I
So,
think that's the big key difference is
mhm,
when you're opening up something to whatever versus an intention to talk to a specific person. Um,
right.
and especially with spirit boards, like let's say you move into a new house, for example, and you know there's a lot of activity and you're like, man, I need to figure out what's going on. Well, I got this spirit board here, so I'm going to whip it out and try to figure it out. There's no guarantees that that spirit board is even going to tell you the truth as to what it is that you are dealing with.
Right. And
And
we're
when
going
you
to touch on that a little bit too. Right. Yeah.
right, so when you open up that portal and you start asking questions, you, unless you are a medium or sensitive or something like you don't know what you're inviting in. You just don't. You're opening it up and
Right.
anything can come in. And
And
that is,
oh yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Yeah.
no, that's just, that is the inherent danger of it. Um, but the same applies to anybody that lives in a haunted house, I think. So, when you start opening up communication, you're inviting more activity. And that's the bottom line.
And the other thing too, just to touch on briefly here, is we do need to understand too that living people can cause activity in their own home, right? So, and this can happen as well. So let's
Right.
say, for example, you pull out a spirit board or you sit down with a group of friends and you're going to have a mock seance for fun, right? And so you can find that things will start happening and or manifesting. It may have nothing to do with a spirit whatsoever. It could actually be a result of the energy of the living people creating this dynamic. We see that when we go into haunting situations where there's no spirit present, because that becomes something very different. A haunting is basically just an imprint. So in the same way, you could be doing a seance, all of a sudden start hearing sounds. That could be a result of the living people themselves that are actually creating that. So we have to be very careful to realize too that you could be manifesting the very activity that you don't want to have.
I think there's a two-sided coin to that though, because for what I understand, if you're in a paranormal investigation, for example, let's just say anywhere that is haunted, spirits tend to use your energy to manifest, which is a lot of the times why people will feel drained and sick and whatnot. So is that your energy creating it, or is that the spirits?
Well, it depends because, if we look at poltergeist cases, they have nothing to do with spirits. Poltergeist cases are a result of living people, right? So that's been basically proven scientifically. That's pretty much the model. That's not always the case, but in a majority of the situation, it is a result of some living person, right? Okay. So that poltergeist is a result of their energy creating that. That same type of thing can occur when you get a group of individuals together who are trying to create a spooky environment. So I'm not saying that spirit interaction isn't and doesn't happen. Obviously, as mediums, we know that's not true.
Right.
But the question is you can be creating it yourself, feeding that activity, which then feeds your fear. Then again, could it be coming from spirit? The answer to that could be yes. But this is what you were talking about. By not having that level of discernment, you don't know what you're dealing with. And the next thing you know, you're knee deep in all this activity that you welcomed.
Right.
But you really don't know what it is. Could it be spirit based? Could it be a result of your own intentions? That has to be sorted out. But in the meantime, people are struggling with trying to go with, well, wow, what's happening?
Right.
So I just wanted to kind of point out a little bit of that other side there where we know, that human beings, living people, can create activity the same way that spirits can. And sometimes that takes a little bit of work to figure out who and or what is doing those types of things.
I agree.
But back to the open invitation, I always equate it to the fact that you are not going to have a party and open your front door and put a sign in your yard that says anyone welcome. No one would do that because
Right.
what's the first thing you're going to say? Well, I don't know who's going to come in my house. What if they rob me? What if they steal me? What if they are, what if they're here to eat all my food and walk out with blah, blah, blah. You
Right.
don't have a party without a specific intention for who you're going to invite. And that is very much something that we need to remember there. So that leads us to, which we also kind of already touched on, is a lack of proper intention for why someone is doing the work, right? You need to have an intention for what you're doing it for. there's nothing wrong with being curious. I remember starting out wanting to do EVPs, and we did too, because we wanted to have that experience, but we still had an intention behind it that was for higher learning, for
Right.
the result of educating ourselves, becoming more aware of the equipment. So I think that that proper intention is there. What would be some improper intentions? Like you said, just having them open ended?
I think I don't want to say that curiosity is an improper intention, because I am guilty of that as well. I mean,
Likewise,
in my
we all
younger,
are. It's human
yeah.
nature.
So, I mean, I don't know. I think improper intention is just it's just checking yourself. What is it that you're looking for? You know, to what end are you trying to figure out what this activity is all about? There's nothing wrong, like I said, with documenting, I guess, things that are happening in your house. But I still feel that the more that you document those things, the more they're going to continue to happen. So you need to ask yourself, am I okay with this activity right now? Or do I want it to stop? Because if I want it to stop, I need to stop feeding it energy. And
Right.
whether that's fear-based
Attention. Right. Mhm.
or or encouragement, it's either way, because if you're scared, that's feeding it one thing, and if you're encouraging it, that's doing something else. So either way, it depends on what you're after, I guess. If are you trying to get rid of it? Because if you're trying to get rid of it, stop talking to it.
Right. Well, then that's an improper intention. I want to have a fake seance and I want to scare my friends. Okay. Well, be
Right.
careful what you wish for.
Yeah.
Whether a spirit comes in and perhaps causes that, or whether you guys are manifesting it yourself as living people, either one, you could end up starting to have some unwanted. So to me, that would be an improper attention.
Right.
Is just kind of wanting to do things for the wrong reasons. So I think you're right. Just having people check themselves. We already talked about too, some of the concerns is, for the most part, we lack that discernment between whether or not the interaction is positive or negative. We don't know if we're being lied to until we develop discernment. I remember even when I was beginning my mediumship development very early on, I didn't have that level of discernment. That takes a period of time to develop and for us to be able to understand if who and what we're connecting with is valid and reliable, because I can tell you, hey, let's look at the politicians today. I can tell you anything I want to hear. It doesn't mean that I'm telling you the truth.
Right. Exactly.
And unless you have the ability to read into, to interpret whether or not that energy coming from that source is helpful, you may want to be cautious. And people say, well, it was accurate. Accurate doesn't mean that someone, again, doesn't have a bad intention, right? Because the spirit can give you a bunch of data. Doesn't mean that it's wrong. And then people can get sucked in by that. We gain that trust because the information is valid. And then we gain a level of trust. And then the next thing you know, we've surrendered our power, and it's taking us down a path where we're not using our own judgment anymore.
Right.
And again, I equate that to politicians today. We start to trust to a level of degree that we don't apply critical thinking. And the next thing we know, if we're connected with a spirit who's less than positive, they've got a hook in us.
Yep.
And so we can't surrender our power is another thing too. So, of course, again, that also means that a lot of people that are doing this probably don't have any particular strategies for protecting themselves or their home. They're not aware that they need it, and they may not be aware how to do it.
One thing I would just point out is, let's say you are in contact with some sort of spirit, and they seem to be harmless, right? Ask yourself these questions. Are they hindering my life in any way, shape, or form? Are they waking me up at night? Are they constantly bombarding me with information? Mm-hmm. Are they breaking stuff? Are they, destructive? Whatever it is, if it's negative,
disrespectful.
Right. We need to know that, well, it's just George. He gets mad every now and then. Well, okay, sorry, George, get out of here then, Another thing is that spirits don't need to be here. Like, oh, it's fine. They're just hanging around. Well, it's not really in their best interest to just hang around. It's not in your best interest to hang around. I think, yeah, it's a fine line. Everybody has,
It is a fine line, but you're raising really good points. Yes.
right? Well, everybody has a certain soul contract, and not everybody is going to cross right away. That's fine. But again, if these individuals, whether it's, a person or even something worse, if it's hindering your life, or if it's causing you issues, maybe it's causing you health issues even, and you're not even aware of that.
Right.
Stop feeding it energy. Stop, trying to record it. Stop talking to it. You know what I mean? It's like,
absolutely. Especially if it's a random spirit, if it is Uncle George, for example, and I remember years ago, this was, many years ago, when I was still with the Washington State Ghost Society, I was invited to come in, and it ended up being a family member that had not passed all the way over, but was wanting to remain in the home and was causing some physical manifestations, especially in the kitchen. He loved to cook. And so it seemed like he was still cooking.
Yeah.
In the middle of the night, they would hear cabinets and that kind of stuff going on. And the family was fine with that. And I said, well, that's okay, because Uncle George, right?
Right.
And at the same time, it's kind of like, remember, treat this like you would if the family member was still alive. Do you really want them there, or are they really just kind of invading your space? So I think
right. And is that even in his best interest?
Well, that's his decision. That's his choice.
It's still his decision, but it's still an option to be like, hey, you'd be a lot better off, and you would feel a lot better, and you can still come back and pretend that you're cooking, only in a different vibration.
He wasn't ready. And so, my perspective is I'm not going to force someone. That violates their free will. So
sure.
It has to
but
be
that you have to understand, you have your own free will, and you're entitled
Absolutely.
to your space. So
yes,
if
100%.
you don't like it, you can kick them out. And that's because that's not okay. Like, I don't subscribe to that either, where people.
But I think that's a personal decision, is what we're saying. And there's a big difference between if it's a family member versus a random person. Those are very, very different scenarios. There may be a reason that a loved one, especially that has recently passed, is still in that space. And that would need to be negotiated in a very different way from these random spirits that are violating your boundaries.
Every single case like that is different, and every single case
it is. That's right. Because we're human beings, whether we're in physical form or in spirit. We still have emotions, decisions, thoughts, processes that are going on, and we need to bear that.
Now, I will say in particular, fae, like people that have fae lines or fae, fairy kind of magic in their place, or they see lots of orbs and stuff like that. For the most part, my understanding is they don't like to be recorded. They don't really like people for the most part. So when you get this kind of activity where it's like they don't even want you there, they don't like this attention that you're giving them, and then you make it worse by going in and aggravating, especially when we see, like on paranormal shows where they go in there and they start really provoking these spirits. Do not do that kind of stuff in your house just because you saw it done on TV. That is not it's
disrespectful all the way around. Again, it's like respect goes both ways. If you want respect from the other side, then you have to give it as well, right?
Right.
And so people tend not to do that. It becomes kind of a sideshow, which is unfortunate from television. It becomes kind of this, it's going to be fun. You get a group of teens that don't maybe perhaps take it seriously. And I understand we don't talk about this in society, so there's no judgment there. But that intention again, and that basis starts to get there, that kind of turns things into a little bit of a disrespectful type of environment. So, but not being able to protect oneself or one's home, that lack of strategies was the point that I was kind of making, is another reason why it may not be safe. If you don't know how to protect your personal space or your home, be careful that you've invited something in, and then now you're going to go, gee, now what do I do about it?
Right.
So if you have strategies in place and you're capable of doing that, then perhaps that, that you've got that extra step there, but a lot of people don't.
Well, and a lot of people will, like, again, moving into the haunted house scenario, or maybe you've had it that way for a long time, and then you decide to invite a paranormal team into your home to do some kind of investigation, and they stir things up, and then they leave you there with a big mess. Don't do that either. Like,
Well, and
really,
sometimes that can happen, and
right?
that's why it's
So
important to be sure that you're working with someone that's going to not just come in, observe, and leave, but
be
has got
respectful. Yeah, that they
some,
have some sort of
that they
ethics.
have some strategies and some tools for being able to help you. Or at the very least, if they can't help you directly, being able to refer you to people who can.
Exactly.
That's important as well. And so I think the other thing, as far as potential concerns and issues, is remember that spirits are not bound by time or space, meaning they can show up anywhere and anytime. They aren't mysteriously located in a cemetery or some haunted location. Those things are things that we see on television. So
Right.
when you're in, you don't have to go to the cemetery to do that. So people think, well, I'll just do it home and invite them here, and that's fine. But as you've already said, you're kind of opening up that door and allowing anything to come in. And bringing up that point, you said, like, the activity can continue to increase. And then the next thing you know is you're stuck into a hole that you don't know how to get out of.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so being aware. So those are some of the issues and concerns that we wanted to bring up. Did I miss anything? Do we think we hit all of those?
Gosh, I hope so.
If something else comes up, we'll bring it up, right?
Right. I just want to say, it might seem harmless, but just really think about the important thing is your intentions behind it,
Right. Right. So then that leads me to the next point that we wanted to talk about, is, can it be done safely? And I think the answer is yes, in some cases. Again, I use the example of the fact that mediums actually work from home. If we look at somebody like Sonia Rinaldi, now she's a Brazilian medium, but she uses EVP work in conjunction with her sitters, which means that she invites the spirit to imprint EVPs during the session. Then she provides the sitter with those recordings as evidence of their loved one coming through. Now, I'm not going to get into the scientific, what about this and what about that, because I understand there's a lot of skepticism about who and where that's coming from. That's not the point of this conversation.
Right.
But she is doing this in a very targeted, intentional, controlled manner, and it is working successfully as far as she and her clients are concerned. So the answer is yes, it can be done safely, but we have to look at all of these various ways that this woman has set things up so that they are taking place in a very structured, rather than this haphazard, random, untrained way. Right?
Exactly. I would say that your first and foremost line of protection is your intention. But asking, guides and angels to be there and keep the space protected before you go ahead and do this kind of activity. Even when I do a mediumship session with someone, I'm still making that intention to keep it a sacred space as I'm connecting with my client. So
we've set the intention for, I think, for both of us, to provide healing, love, reassurance, knowledge, wisdom, guidance. There's this and you hear people in the woo-woo community, we've set a very high vibration for what it is that we're wanting to connect with. And we expect that will come through in the communication itself.
Right. And just like I've heard so many mediums say, oh, I've never had any kind of negative activity, or I've never, come across anything really super negative. Well, it's probably because you're not doing that kind of work. You're literally just connecting with people's loved ones. And so that's what's going to come through. That's what you're looking for. That's the intention that you've set. That's the intentions that you've made with your guides. And so therefore that is what you expect and what will happen. So do I expect these people to get bombarded with negative spirits while they're trying to do a reading? No, actually, I don't.
Right.
I think that the problem comes when we don't have an intention at all. We're just willy-nilly looking for
Right.
some kind of adrenaline rush or activity or proof that, we'll see that I told you my place was haunted, or see, I told you ghosts are real, et cetera, et cetera. And it's like, well, how much proof do you actually want? Because you might get more than you bargained for.
Right.
So that's it.
Well, and that's a good example too. And the other thing too, when we're talking about mediums being trained, or even if you're not a trained medium, but you're setting that expectation really for really very high connection.
Mm-hmm.
When we start vibrating, when we're healthy or when we're healing, and I hate to use that word vibration, but that's really what it is, right? When we come from this loving space, it is difficult for negative things to kind of be okay in that environment, right? So it's kind of like, here's this person, here's an example. You ever go to a party and there's that person that's always happy and they're go lucky and they're just da, 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 and you're in this really grouchy mood and you're like, I cannot deal with that person right now. That person is always happy. They're driving me freaking crazy. I'm out of here. And that's really what it's like. If you have that type of psychic vibration going on with you, and that's just energy work or loving or positive, and somebody comes up and they're grouchy and they're negative, the last thing they want to do is put up with your crappy positive attitude. So that's what we mean when we say a lot of mediums are vibrating at this very high loving level that in many ways kind of repels negative energy. Now, I want you to think about this. And this was funny because I was watching my instructor the other day do a lecture, and he was talking about this. On the flip side, if you have really negative, crappy energy, right? If you have a negative environment or a negative aspect about yourself, because we all do, nobody's perfect,
right?
That can actually draw that negativity towards you. Now, here's some examples. Spirits that want to be around bars because they used to be alcoholics, they get that buzz from being in that energetic environment. They can't drink anymore, but they get that, they still kind of get that little high from that.
So they can literally attach to you and experience
what you're experiencing. That's what a psychic connection is. And the same thing is true whether, for drug users and or let's say, for example, people that are incredibly angry, people that may have other addictions,
I hate to dog on alcohol and stuff like that all the time, but it does lower your vibration as well. So it's continuously putting you at risk, if that makes sense.
Well, so I don't want to make it sound like, you're going to have these negative attacks. But again,
it is entirely possible is the problem. And the more that you drink, I think the more you have less and less control over your vibration, over yourself anyways. So you become more vulnerable. It doesn't mean that it's going to happen, but it means that it could.
But that's true for any negative vibration. It could even be fear, right?
Or anger. If you let's say you go just let's say you go somewhere and you're super pissed off, you would be at more risk going on an investigation super pissed off than you would just having a beer.
Well, and that could be true. Yeah, I would agree with that. So I think the point of this is being aware of our own energy, being aware of our own state of mind. And that's why we sometimes will say, why do I have this person that's kind of feeding off of me? There can be a variety of reasons. Some of them may be very innocent, and others may be atmospheres that have set it up where that, like you said, that spirit is able to settle into that. If you're the kind of person that loves bitching all the time, you probably find you hang out with other people who bitch all the time because you guys can get together and bitch together.
It's a bitch fest.
It's a bitch fest. So, and I find myself guilty of doing that sometimes. It's like, I want to get with other people who can bitch with me. So I want you to think about that with spirits as well. What is it that's in your daily life that lowers your vibration and could be setting you up to have connections with other spirits that are at that same vibe? So again, it's not meant to scare people. These are just examples of how things can innocently happen if you're not aware of them, and just kind of providing some education there.
Yeah.
So let's talk about safeguards to put in place. And I think we've already talked about a lot of these, but I want to be able to leave this show today with giving people some really good tips and strategies. And right up front, we've already said it 1,000 times, set the right intention for only positive, uplifting connections for the purpose of healing, learning, and growing. Right? So
yes, absolutely.
I think we've hammered that issue home all the time. Never hang up a welcome sign for just any spirit to visit. You don't do this with living people, so don't do it with the departed. Try to have an intention, right?
Yes.
For who, not just the right type, but for who. And you've touched on this briefly also. Set boundaries for times for connecting, along with designating a specific area while you will work, right? So unless it's coming from my spiritual team, or someone that is directly related, like a family member or someone that is connected with me in the past that I have a relationship with, this is the room where you connect with me, not the rest of my home.
Right.
Right. This is my space. And or I will set up times when I am in a meditative or welcoming state.
Right.
And then you may connect with me. And anything that happens outside of my boundaries, I'm going to go, why are you here?
Exactly.
And
you should not be bombarded. You should not be, bombarded, I guess is the word.
Now, if spirit has something really important to say, right? If something happens, because I have had that happen, but it's very brief and it's respectful in nature. It's not, right, like you said, it's not constant. They're not waking you up in the middle of the night, or they're not bothering you when you're doing this. It's not disruptive.
And it's not scary. It shouldn't be too scary. I mean, granted, certain activity straight up is scary no matter who you are, like, or at least startling.
Well,
like,
it catches you off guard. And I think there's a difference between being intrusive and frightening versus catching you off guard. And you have to analyze that.
Right. So I think, like, let's say, for example, Uncle George is kind of a trickster at heart. If he starts messing with the light, I'm not really going to be concerned about that. Or
as long as you know it's Uncle George, because you don't know who it is.
As long as you, right. But let's say we've established that it is Uncle George. Okay. Sure. And so we're like, okay, it's Uncle George. He messes with the lights. It's fine. No big deal. But like I said, when it starts to get to a certain point, people are like, oh, I had scratches. I woke up with scratches, or I woke up with bruises, or, that is not okay activity. Right. That is not something that you should even ignore. Like, you need help. So don't encourage it by any means by trying to capture it on video. If people don't believe you, then screw them. You know what's happening to you. You don't necessarily need.
Well, I do think, I don't know. I mean, I'll disagree with you a little bit there. I think the documentation is really important, especially if you want to be able to get down to the bottom of things.
It is, but to what end?
Right. Don't obsess about it. Just, okay, here it is. And then try not to think about it and move on. I realize.
Or at least, like maybe you can't help it because you have security cameras, or but what I'm saying is, like, if you're sitting there with your cell phone in your bed and you're scared and you're trying to capture all these different orbs, and it's like,
right.
Why are you doing that? Oh, because all this stuff is happening. Well, you're literally helping it happen by sitting there with your cell phone, trying to record it, talking to it, asking questions.
Right.
Like, if that's your first time, that's one thing. But if you keep doing it over and over and over again, is what I'm saying is the problem. So there's no problems with wanting to have evidence or, capturing something on your security cameras or something like that. But when it becomes this kind of obsessive activity, and, you just want the next best piece of evidence that you can find so you could submit it to paranormal con on camera or whatever, then don't ask why you have all this activity.
Right. No, I understand. And I agree with that 100%. Yeah, I do. So again, if just kind of back up to that one where I was saying, be sure that you are setting times and boundaries for those types of connections. Obviously, if things are happening randomly, then that's kind of a different scenario. But if you intentionally want to start doing things, if it's mediumship or you're trying to grow your abilities and your connections, just make sure that that's being done in a controlled way. And anything that's positive and loving will be respectful of your boundaries. And again, remembering too that sometimes activity is not based on an actual spirit, but we attribute it to a spirit. It can have very rational, normal explanations. If you find yourself in a state of fear, you are probably not looking for solutions in a rational manner. And I would encourage you to reach out to someone that can help you. And whether or not you get a hold of us or another reliable paranormal group is fine, but start looking for some answers, because if you're in a fear-based scenario, you're already just kind of recognize that you're probably not being objective about things and that you do need some assistance, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Right. And that goes for, even going off base, out of your home into somewhere else that you wanted to do an investigation. I think those same kind of rules apply. So,
yeah. As far as setting boundaries, you mean? And
setting boundaries, your intentions,
and recognizing that if you're afraid,
right? Because when you go into a place like that you already know has a history, or you already know is scary, you're bringing a certain level of fear into it. And I don't want to discourage people from their curiosity, of course, but definitely do some diligence as far as keeping yourself protected and not pushing your limits, meaning provoking too much, I guess, in a place that could be dangerous, that's just straight up. But in your house, it's even worse because I think because
you're supposed to be your safe space, right?
Right.
Your home is your safe space. And when your personal space, whether that be your home or your personal energy field, is violated, that is deeply personal at that point. And that really shatters people. And, people come back with PTSD. I know that that's happened for me when I had a negative spirit experience in my home. And so there's a lot of ramifications that can come from this that people don't really foresee. And that's the other reason for the show, is kind of just providing some education that those potentials do exist, not to scare people, just to bring some things to the reality. Again, right. You wouldn't leave your doors open at night and just say, sure, anybody come on in. You're taking precautions to protect your space. It's not any different. So, and again, we kind of just touched on this. The next one that I had was proper spirit interactions will respect your personal wishes. At any time that you find that you're not being respectful, you need to become aware that something may be potentially wrong. Now, again, the only exception I would probably give to that at this time is if, Aunt Martha passed away a week ago and you didn't know about it, and she really wants you to know that she's there and she's got a message. Sometimes a loved one will be very persistent because they're trying to get through to someone, or trying to get through to you if you're in a deep state of grief. That is different. That is trying to give a gesture of love, right?
Right. And
as opposed to invasion.
Right. And typically what will happen in that kind of situation as well is that once that spirit has been acknowledged and, the story has kind of come out and all the information is there, and we're like, oh, we know it's Uncle George. It's okay. It's not.
Things will back off because
and then all of a sudden the activity will subside and you're like, oh, I guess, it's not that big a deal. And it's because that was the main goal, was to let Uncle George is okay. He was here for a minute. Now he can move on because you acknowledged.
Right.
Yay.
Yeah. And that's very different. So it was persistent, but then it became respectful. So very true. If you're using any tools, the next one is, and because you're unable to discern who or what you're connecting with, then realize you could be being deceived. So this means you may need to be just a little extra careful, but don't ever surrender your personal decision-making power. Okay. So in other words, I've seen people using a spirit board. Oh, well, my dad says that I need to get a new car. Well, first of all, how do you know it's your dad? if you don't have the psychic discernment for it, you're just trusting
Right.
that someone it is. You're willing to go out and spend money that you don't have because you think your dad is telling you to get a new car, right? So
Yeah.
then what you've done is you put yourself in debt and into a situation because a spirit told you to do it. So we cannot surrender our personal decision-making power, and any connection from spirit that is positive and loving will
Right.
never, never, ever, ever cause you to lose your decision-making power or take your power away from you. And that is a first sign that you are being led astray.
I have said this many times to people, is that guides will not tell you what to do.
Never,
They
never.
will give you advice. They will tell you,
Correct.
things that are factual, but they won't tell you what to do
Right.
with that information because of free will. So if you have, and I don't know, maybe family members could be guilty of it, as far as, because they're not necessarily, entirely enlightened, I guess, but
right.
So they might try to tell you what to do, but
but there should be enough evidence and awareness from that spirit before, even then I would be very hesitant. Don't
and it's not like they'll tell you need to do this. It's more like, these are the things you need to look at and the things that you need to weigh out for yourself. It's not, if you don't do this, then it's going to be bad, kind of thing. So good.
No, I will. Yeah. And you're right. And I will caveat that by saying I was watching a Suzanne Giesman video yesterday where she had connected, and her guides were telling her that she needed to go into a specific store. And so she did that. So in many ways, yes, she was being guided to do that. Then when she got in there, there was actually 2 really big signs that validated an experience that they had given to her. So this validation supported this spiritual connection, but it was different.
Slightly different.
Yeah. It's like,
it's not a life-changing decision.
Right, exactly. If you don't go into the store, okay, you probably would have missed the validation that you asked for, but it's not like we're telling you to go do something that could be harmful. So just bear in mind that never give up your power.
Right.
Even to your guides. Your guides will never ask you to give up your power.
No.
They're giving you information to empower you, not disempower you. And if you don't have the discernment, then that's really important that you need to remember that at all times. Okay.
Most definitely.
We also already talked about the other strategy is learning some basic home protection and personal protection strategies, whether you do rituals, and I don't mean like witchcraft, I mean lighting candles, saying some prayers, reading from a Bible, saging, salting, whatever it is that works for you, meditation, that makes you feel safe. I know you've done your grounding blog and the saging blog and keeping our energy clear and clean. These are certain things that we can do. I know they feel woo-woo, but they work. Right? You're setting the intention for keeping your space safe. So be sure that you learn some of those things, especially if you're noticing activity. The internet is full of rituals or ways and methods and visualizations and tools that you can use to keeping your personal self safe. So don't say, well, I don't know how to do it. There's the internet. It's everywhere. Right. So learn those strategies. And I think the other thing too that we both know is that even if we have all of these protocols in place, things can still happen.
Yeah.
Right. Innocently. Yeah. For example, I've shared this in other ones where I had a gal that wanted to connect me for a session. She was pretty adamant. So I went ahead and called her and we just talked a little bit. She ended up not doing the session. Things were really weird to me. And then about a week later, I felt like she was right there. She had somehow kind of gotten into my personal space, regardless of whether it was intentional or not. There she was. Now I was able to detect that. So I had that level of discernment to realize that something had happened, but it was just an innocent connection with this woman. And that happens, right? So let's say, for example,
that wasn't innocent at all.
Well, I mean, in the sense that I was simply reaching out to her because she was asking me for a session, but then she had a negative intention. Same
That's,
thing. You could be getting out of your car at the grocery store and somebody just wants to come up, steal your purse, and punch you in the face. You didn't do anything wrong. You became a victim in that moment of
right.
someone else's negative intentions.
Exactly.
So we can do all of these strategies. And that's why I think too, for psychics, they're like, well, I don't believe that can ever happen because it's never happened to me. Good for you. I've never been mugged either, but I will
Yeah,
tell you that that doesn't negate the fact that some people have. And we
exactly.
can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And we also can't say to that person that got mugged in the parking lot, it was their fault. That's absurd.
Right.
That is absurd. Some people simply have, living or departed, have bad intentions,
Exactly.
flat out.
Right.
And we become victims, even if it's not our fault.
Exactly.
And we've discussed this in other videos as well.
Mhm.
So being aware that that can happen. So you don't want to set yourself up to being a victim by walking down a dark hallway or an alley in the middle of the night, flashing your money. Right?
Right. That's not a good idea.
But sometimes things
But in
do
the same
happen.
thing, like you're saying, it's like, okay, so let's say you have discovered that, there is something negative in your home. The last thing that you want to do is to like keep feeding it this kind of energy,
Right.
by, filming it or talking to it or just straight up encouraging it because that's what
Right.
you're doing. Um,
And that's why it's good to reach help. And I know I don't charge for my paranormal work. You don't charge for yours. And most reliable people that are doing and wanting to legitimately help their clients don't charge. The worst they may ask you for is to help cover some travel expenses if they have to drive to your location. But
right.
otherwise, most people that are doing this from a reliable perspective are there to want to help. So find a way to do that.
Right. And just don't exacerbate the issue, I think is the biggest thing. Like some
Yep.
people can't help it. If you live in a really active area, um, that's nothing you can really help, but you can also not make it worse by, like I said, trying to record it all the time or talking to them all the time, or I don't, because it just encourages it.
It can encourage that, right? And the other thing too is which is another thing that you can do to protect yourself is remember to stay calm and don't get afraid. And I realize that that is a tough thing to do. It's like, let's use that mugging scenario again. If you start panicking and freaking out, you freeze, right? You need to
Right.
remain calm. It's not a pleasant situation, but adding fear does not help. And if a spirit is intentionally coming and invading your space, they're getting off on the fact that you're afraid. Right.
Yeah.
They
And
may be enjoying that. And by you not fueling that, again, I understand it's easier said than done, but you need to be able to react calmly to that. Okay. So there's some stuff going on here. I
right.
probably need to figure out what's going on so I can get this taken care of because
Right.
A, I don't want it. I'm not welcoming it. It's bothering me. It's disruptive. And that is setting an intention right there that you want it to stop, but then also not feeding it with your fear because that's
Exactly.
important as well.
Exactly. I had some activity at my old place and I wasn't sure how to deal with it. And so the more I guess, figured out, how to keep my space clear, the more empowered I felt. And so eventually it was mostly gone. And then when I, when I moved out, my neighbor was like, ever since you moved out, the activity has increased tenfold. And I was like, oh, that's bad. So I was doing something right to keep it at bay. Not sure why it all came crashing down on her, but it was an interesting observation because when I first moved in, it was pretty active. I mean, I remember a few times, hearing voices in the living room, or I even fell asleep on the couch one time and got like totally flicked right between the eyes in my face. And I woke up and I was like, what the heck? So it was kind of, it's alarming. I mean, you don't
Right.
You don't
It
want to
is
feed into
jarring.
the
It is.
fear.
It is. Absolutely. Yeah.
You don't want to feed into the fear, but that was immediately my solution-based mind is like, well, how do I get rid of it? What do I do? You know,
Right.
so I start talking to my friends. Oh, you need to sage. Oh, you need to do this. Oh, you need to do that. Okay, let's do it.
Right.
So I kind of had a crash course.
You were solution oriented, I guess, is the point.
Yeah,
Which is there's a difference between being afraid and going, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do. Okay, well, that's true for most people in this scenario.
right. And
So
it wasn't
what?
that I
Let's
wasn't
switch that.
scared. I mean, it scared me, but I needed to kind of get over that. Okay, well,
Right. Right.
next, what do I do to get rid of it?
Right. Right.
And
So move into that solution oriented space where you can kind of, as best you possibly can, kind of calmly and rationally say, okay, something needs to happen here. And then what is that next step? And as you start to do that, you're kind of shifting your focus off the very activity itself and moving towards a solution. And oftentimes just working towards a solution, it can do two things. It can either make the spirit angrier, and so the activity intensifies, which makes it more difficult. But again,
I will say that happened.
it can happen, but
yeah,
the other can happen where it's kind of like, okay, they're not buying into this. I'm gonna move on to somewhere else and deal with or bother someone who will be more jarred by the
I
scenario.
will say that the activity increased because I did the one thing you're not supposed to do, which is sage in fear or smudging in fear.
Mm-hmm.
Like I was like, oh my God, I'm scared. So
you were just spreading the fear around.
Yeah, it's
like that's why the saging itself is not really important part. It's the intention behind it.
Exactly. And so when I finally wrapped my mind around that, I was like, oh, fairy dust, let's do it different. So then it started having better results. And then I was going for longer periods of time with no activity. But again, it could be something that you have to do on a regular basis, and it will depend on where you live and, what kind of activity is in that area, because I do believe that, certain places are just going to have more. And if you got the short straw when, you moved in, you might have to deal with stuff like that. And it wasn't something that you knew right off the bat. Sometimes it takes a minute to show up. But again, this whole idea of, well, let's bring over a paranormal group and start, doing an EVP session and recording all this stuff. Well, okay, if that's your intention, is to find the evidence, but then what? So it's not just let's find evidence and keep finding evidence. Let's find the evidence and figure out,
because we're looking for a solution.
Exactly.
And that kind of leads me to my next point, which is we also need to remember that events and experiences happen that are not caused by negative spirits, living people, hauntings or imprints, residual stuff. There are, we know that people can put EVPs, imprint an EVP. Living people can do that. If spirits can do it, living people can do it too. So you may hear something on an audio tape that you've recorded. You may not know whether or not that was you doing it, whether it was a haunting EVP or whether it was a spirit EVP. Those are all very, very different. And so people will get a recording, they will hear something. I use the example of they may hear the phrase, get out, and they may jump to this huge conclusion that that's a negative spirit that's telling them something evil. Well, what happens if there was a fire in that location 10 years earlier and it's a fireman saying, get out, or it's a living member, it's a person that was living at the time saying, get out. That's a prime example of you don't really know the context of what the get out was. You've leapt to the conclusion that it was by an active spirit, that it had a negative intention. That EVP alone is not enough information for you to become fearful and leap to a conclusion, because there are a wide variety of explanations. And this is why talking to someone that's got the training, the experience, and the background, and who can be objective for you is important. Not everything is based on a spirit or negative spirit.
Right. It doesn't have to be negative.
That's right.
It does not have
so there's a wide range of other possible scenarios that need to be explored. The situation I was telling you about, I kind of got to observe, but partake in just a little bit last week, was involving a photograph. this person was terrified regarding what they saw in the photograph. But within a couple of days, a bunch of us had all kind of thrown our theories out there. We figured out exactly what it was and had nothing to do with the spirit. And we were able to, the team that was doing the actual work was able to deliver their diagnosis for what it was. And that person went, oh my gosh, that is what it is. And then completely relaxed. It had a very logical explanation, even though they admitted to having been playing with a spirit board. But then they started noticing other things in the house, most of which we feel were probably based on the fact that they were afraid and they became hyper vigilant to everything that they hadn't noticed before. Right. So they heard this sound over here. And so their fear was feeding into that. And then so basically everything died down again. So I'm saying don't leap to the conclusion that just because you used a spirit board and now this and this is happening, that it's always spirit related. There can be other explanations for things. And I think that that's important for people to remember.
Very true. I would also, though, warn certain skeptics, like just because you think it's not going to work doesn't mean it won't bring some kind of activity either.
No, and I think the bulk of our conversation has been very much from that believer's perspective, because I know that we both believe in that, right? But at the same time, I don't want to go so far to one side that I don't encourage people to say, look, there could be very rational explanations for your experiences, which is why you want to stay calm and not leap to conclusions. And let's vet out those things perhaps that have very rational explanations from whether or not real activity is going on. So,
right. Especially in your own home, because otherwise you do perpetuate this fear type setting in your house, and that's not good.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. And then the other strategy is just to remember that like energy attracts like energy again, right? There's a lot of anger and fighting going on in the home. That's not to say that you're welcoming someone to come in and have negative activity. But if you've got that energy in your home where there's always arguing or always fighting, and then all of a sudden you're inviting an investigation or you want to do recording, you may get someone that likes the energy of your home.
Right.
And then the next thing you know, you got this spirit that likes hanging out, and then you guys are becoming angrier and angrier and angrier, and you don't really know why. And that's because you've added another energetic form into the equation. You've now got instead of maybe 2 people living in the house, you've got 3 people, one who's in spirit, who's just as angry as the 2 of you are. And so the anger intensifies. And so those are things that have to be looked at as well.
Yeah, you can definitely attract things that weren't there before just by your vibration.
Which is why you will hear people, and we dismiss this as woo-woo, but keeping the right frame of mind, you know, solving those solutions that you have, whether there's addictions or emotional issues, past traumas, anger, whatever that is, you're not vibrating at a high level. You're not living your life at a higher level. And then if you want to go do paranormal work or some other type of psychic work, and you're in those lower states, I just think that you want to be cautious of your state of mind. There's times when I am really upset, especially over the election and all the political season. I said to people, I'm not doing any sessions right now. I am not in the frame of mind personally to work well, to be balanced. And I just stopped doing them. So that was protecting me and my space. So I think we need to be aware of that.
I face the same problems for the same reason. And honestly,
it's challenging.
It's been really difficult to go from being angry to trying to meditate into woosah, I'm so happy.
That's right. It is. Because we're all human. We're all human.
La, 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 la. And
we're all human, right?
It can be hard. But again, just again, the intentions of what is it that you're after if you are doing some sort of evidence gathering in your home, whether that's with a spirit board, EVPs, your phone, your security camera, you know, check your intentions, make sure that you're being solution oriented. If it is a negative type of situation, do not feed it energy.
Right.
and really look to solutions of removal. That's what I would suggest.